It's something that I don't completely ignore, but it's not something I take, completely to heart.
Just moments ago, a deeply unsettling development unfolded at Windsor, one serious enough that William and Catherine were reportedly forced to leave the residence under circumstances never meant to become public. This was not a planned departure. It was not a private family decision. It was a response to something discovered behind closed doors. Something that immediately changed the atmosphere, inside one of the monarchy's most secure spaces. According to sources familiar with the situation, the discovery was unexpected and troubling enough to trigger internal protocols. Normal routines were interrupted. Staff movement was restricted. And, within a short span of time, William and Catherine were advised to remove themselves from Windsor altogether. No explanation was offered publicly. No reassurance followed. Only silence, and silence, in royal life often signals seriousness. What makes this moment particularly disturbing is the speed with which events unfolded. There was no gradual escalation, no visible warning. One moment, everything appeared normal. The next, departure became necessary. That contrast has raised urgent questions about what was found, who knew about it, and why immediate action was required. Windsor is not just a residence. It is a symbol of continuity and security. For senior royals to leave under pressure suggests that whatever was uncovered challenged assumptions of safety, privacy, or trust. And when those assumptions are shaken, consequences ripple far beyond a single location. As the palace remains silent, attention turns to the implications. Why was departure the chosen response? Who was informed and who was not? And how serious must the discovery be to override every instinct for discretion? Because if William and Catherine were truly forced to leave Windsor, then what was uncovered, there is something the palace is not yet ready to explain. The departure from Windsor did not follow any familiar pattern. There was no scheduled movement, no advance notice to staff beyond a tightly held circle, and no visible preparation that would suggest a routine change of residence. Instead, the decision unfolded abruptly, driven by information that altered priorities in real time. Those close to palace operations described the atmosphere as measured but urgent, not chaotic, yet unmistakably serious. Windsor Castle operates under layered security and long-established protocol. Any discovery capable of prompting immediate relocation of senior royals must therefore meet a high threshold. This was not a matter of comfort or convenience. It was a response to risk, whether physical, procedural, or reputational, that required distance before assessment could continue. According to sources familiar with internal processes, the discovery emerged during routine internal checks that expanded unexpectedly. What began as a standard review reportedly escalated when something inconsistent appeared, something that did not belong, did not align, or did not fit established records. The nature of that inconsistency has not been disclosed, but the response indicates it was serious enough to override the instinct for discretion that usually governs royal movement. Within minutes, internal communication narrowed. Only essential personnel were briefed. Staff were instructed to continue normal duties while access to specific areas was quietly restricted. This dual approach, calm exterior, controlled interior, is typical of palace crisis management. The goal is to prevent visibility while preserving flexibility. William and Catherine were reportedly informed directly, without intermediaries. That choice alone underscores gravity. When information bypasses layers and reaches senior royals immediately, it suggests that the decision space is limited. Time becomes a factor. Distance becomes precaution. Their departure was described not as evacuation, but as removal, a subtle but important distinction. Evacuation implies immediate danger. Removal implies prevention. It suggests that while no active threat was present, remaining in place could complicate assessment or response. In such cases, stepping away is often the safest option. The timing also matters. Windsor has long been associated with routine family life, particularly for William and Catherine. It is a place of stability, away from the constant pressure of central London. Choosing to leave that environment disrupts more than schedule. It disrupts rhythm. That disruption is not undertaken lightly. Inside the palace, attention reportedly shifted toward containment. Not concealment, but control. Control of information flow. Control of narrative exposure. Control of operational response. When discoveries intersect with security, trust, or integrity of space, investigation takes precedence over explanation. It is notable that no immediate reassurance followed. In past situations involving benign issues, brief statements have been issued quickly to calm speculation. This time, silence prevailed. Silence here does not imply confusion. It implies deliberation. Words are being weighed against consequences, not yet fully mapped. Speculation has naturally turned toward the nature of the discovery. Security-related explanations have been suggested, but so have procedural irregularities and internal breaches. The palace has offered no guidance, and that absence has widened the field of interpretation. However, those familiar with crisis response caution against assuming dramatic scenarios. Often, the most disruptive findings are not sensational. They are structural issues. Challenge systems rather than individuals. They raise questions about oversight, reliability, and assumptions that have gone unexamined. Addressing them requires space, time, and reduced exposure. Removing senior figures from the environment under review is a standard step in such assessments. For William and Catherine, the personal impact of the decision is significant. Their public roles demand steadiness, but moments like this intrude on private life. Sources indicate that their response was composed, cooperative, and focused on minimizing disruption for those around them. That composure should not be mistaken for ease. Abrupt departures carry emotional weight, especially when explanations cannot be shared. The children's routines were reportedly protected as much as possible. That protection required coordination and discretion, ensuring that changes appeared seamless to those not directly involved. This emphasis on continuity reinforces the idea that the decision was precautionary rather than reactive. Within palace operations, investigators reportedly began parallel assessments. One track focused on the discovery itself, origin, scope, implication. Another focused on process, how it surfaced, who encountered it, and what safeguards may need reinforcement. This dual-track approach allows response without presumption. Observers note that Windsor's symbolic importance heightens sensitivity. Discoveries in such spaces carry institutional weight beyond immediate concern. They invite reflection on systems assumed to be settled. That reflection is often uncomfortable, but necessary. Public reaction has so far been contained, largely because information remains limited. The absence of dramatic language has prevented escalation even as curiosity intensifies. This balance appears intentional. The palace seems determined to avoid fueling speculation while ensuring that response is thorough. What happens next will depend on findings, rather than headlines. If the issue proves contained and resolved, continuity will likely resume quietly. If it reveals deeper concerns, adjustments may follow, subtle, procedural, and largely unseen. In either case, the decision to leave Windsor will be remembered as the moment assessment took precedence over appearance. It is also worth noting that forced departures in royal context are rare. When they occur, they often mark inflection points, not necessarily crises but recalibrations. They signal that something assumed stable requires re-examination. For now, the story remains defined by absence rather than revelation. Absence of detail. Absence of reassurance. Absence of return. These absences are not empty. They are holding space for understanding yet to be formed. Until clarity emerges, the palace will likely maintain this posture. Controlled movement, limited communication, focused inquiry. William and Catherine's departure from Windsor, unsettling as it appears, fits within that pattern. It is not an ending. It is a pause, deliberate, protective, and telling. As William and Catherine settled away from Windsor, attention inside the palace intensified rather than eased. Their departure was not the conclusion of concern, it was the beginning of scrutiny. With senior royals removed from the environment, investigators were given space to work without pressure, expectation, or symbolic presence influencing outcomes. That separation alone suggests the discovery demanded clarity before reassurance. Sources describe a phase of internal lockdown that was precise rather than dramatic. Specific areas within Windsor were isolated. Records were reviewed. Access logs examined. Staff movements cross-checked. None of this required public disruption, but all of it required time. Time during which senior figures could not reasonably remain nearby. This methodical approach points to a discovery that challenged assumptions rather than triggered alarms. In royal operations, assumptions are powerful. They govern trust, access, and routine. When something undermines them, the response is not panic, it is verification. Every layer is examined to determine whether the issue is isolated or systemic. Those familiar with similar situations emphasize that removals are often precautionary when the scope of a discovery is unclear. Keeping senior royals away prevents contamination of process, both literal and symbolic. It ensures that findings are not influenced by presence, urgency, or perceived need for resolution. What remains notable is the absence of any effort to counter speculation. No background briefings. No anonymous reassurances. This restraint suggests that officials do not yet know enough to speak responsibly. In royal communication, uncertainty is treated with silence until facts settle. The nature of the discovery remains undisclosed, but palace watchers point to patterns. When issues are purely technical or benign, statements usually follow quickly. When issues intersect with security, integrity of space, or procedural reliability, silence extends. This moment aligns with the latter. Another telling detail is how routine continued elsewhere. Engagements proceeded. Schedules adjusted subtly. There was no outward sign of emergency. That continuity suggests confidence that immediate danger was not present. At the same time, the choice to relocate William and Catherine signals that remaining would have complicated investigation rather than endangered them, directly. Within the household. Coordination reportedly focused on minimizing disruption for children and staff. The move was framed internally as temporary and precautionary. This framing matters. It reduces anxiety while preserving flexibility. It also reinforces the idea that the decision was strategic, not reactive. William's role during this phase shifted from response to oversight. He reportedly remained in close contact with senior advisors, receiving updates without directing outcomes. This distance preserves objectivity. It also prevents any perception that conclusions are shaped to accommodate senior figures. Catherine's focus, according to those close to the family, remained on stability. Maintaining routine, minimizing discussion, and avoiding speculation within the household were priorities. That discipline reflects experience, an understanding that uncertainty can be more disruptive than bad news if left. Unmanaged. The palace's investigative approach appears to follow a familiar framework. First, establish facts. Second, assess impact. Third, determine remedy. Only then does communication resume. This sequence protects accuracy, but it requires patience, something the public often struggles to grant. Media coverage during this phase has been cautious, but persistent. Analysts are careful not to assign motive or scale without evidence. That caution mirrors the palace's posture, creating an unusual alignment between institution and observers. Both are waiting. What has shifted, however, is perception. Windsor, long seen as a place of quiet continuity, now carries a question mark. Not because of confirmed danger, but because assumption has been interrupted. Once interrupted, assumption rarely returns unchanged. This interruption is significant. Royal spaces are not merely residences. They are systems, governed by layers of trust built over time. When a discovery challenges that trust, even temporarily, it prompts review beyond the immediate issue. Insiders stress that reviews of this kind often uncover secondary adjustments rather than primary faults. Processes are refined, oversight tightened, protocols updated. These changes rarely make headlines, but they shape future operation. William and Catherine's removal from Windsor created the conditions for that refinement to proceed without pressure. Their absence allowed investigators to work without the symbolic weight of senior presence. That absence, though unsettling to observers, is a standard step in high-stakes assessment. It is also notable what has not happened. There has been no rush to return, no visible effort to normalize prematurely. This suggests that assessment is ongoing and that conclusions are not yet final. Public patience will be tested by this delay. Speculation thrives in silence. But from an institutional perspective, silence now prevents contradiction later. Once a statement is made, it must hold. The coming days will therefore be defined by subtle indicators rather than announcements. Access restoration, staff movement, quiet returns. or continued separation. These signals will matter more than words. For now, the palace appears committed to thoroughness over speed. That choice carries short-term discomfort, but it protects long-term credibility. It suggests that whatever was discovered deserves attention beyond optics. William and Catherine's forced departure, unsettling as it appears, fits within that logic. It was not a message to the public. It was a measure taken to protect process. Until that process concludes, movement will remain cautious. Communication will remain limited. And Windsor will remain under quiet examination. This phase is not about explanation. It is about verification, and verification by its nature cannot be rushed. As the inquiry progressed, the focus widened from the initial discovery to the systems that allowed it to exist unnoticed. In institutions built on routine and trust, the most unsettling questions are rarely about what was found, but about how long it remained unseen. That distinction now shapes the palace's response. Investigators are not merely isolating an anomaly. They are stress-testing assumptions that underpin daily life at Windsor. Sources familiar with internal reviews describe a meticulous process. Logs are reconciled against access histories. Maintenance schedules are cross-checked with security records. Oversight chains are examined to identify where verification relied on habit rather than confirmation. This is slow work by design. Speed risks certainty. Certainty requires patience. The decision to keep William and Catherine away during this phase reflects a broader principle: reduce variables. Their presence would introduce pressure, implicit expectations to resolve, to reassure, to normalize. Distance protects objectivity. It also prevents inadvertent signaling that conclusions are already forming when, in reality, assessment remains open. What complicates matters is the layered nature of Windsor itself. It is not a single building with a single function. It is a complex environment where residential, ceremonial, operational, and historical spaces overlap. Each layer has its own protocols, teams, and rhythms. A discovery that crosses those layers can expose gaps, not obvious within any single domain. Investigators are therefore asking not only what the discovery is, but what it touches. Does it implicate process, oversight, documentation, training? Even benign findings can demand significant recalibration if they reveal reliance on assumptions rather than verification. In high-trust environments, assumptions accumulate quietly. The palace's continued silence suggests that findings have not yet been narrowed to a single cause. When conclusions are clear, communication typically follows. When silence persists, it often means the picture remains incomplete or that multiple threads are being evaluated before anyone is acknowledged publicly. This posture has consequences. Prolonged uncertainty invites interpretation. But from an institutional standpoint, premature clarity can be worse than delayed truth. Once a narrative is set, reversing it undermines credibility. The palace appears intent on speaking once, and speaking accurately. William's involvement during this phase has been deliberately bounded. He is briefed, not embedded. That separation preserves impartiality and avoids the perception, internal or external, that outcomes are shaped by senior preference. It also allows him to focus on continuity elsewhere, signaling stability without interfering with assessment. Catherine's role, according to those close to the family, remains protective and practical. Stability at home, discretion in conversation, and avoidance of conjecture are priorities. This discipline reduces emotional spillover at a moment when speculation could easily migrate inward. In environments under review, calm is a resource. The children's routines continue to anchor that calm. Predictability in uncertain moments is not cosmetic. It is functional. It keeps stress contained and prevents disruption from cascading. The effort to preserve normalcy reinforces the sense that the move from Windsor was precautionary rather than reactive. Within palace operations, teams are reportedly working on parallel tracks. One focuses on the immediate discovery, its origin, scope, and remediation. Another examines governance, how checks are structured, how accountability is enforced, and where redundancies might be strengthened. This second track often yields the most lasting change. Such reviews rarely result in dramatic announcements. Instead, they produce quiet adjustments, revised access protocols, enhanced audits, clearer sign-offs. These changes are invisible by design, but they shape future resilience. The public may never learn the specifics, Yet the institution will operate differently because of them. Media coverage has begun to reflect this nuance. Initial framing around disturbance is giving way to analysis of process and precedent. Commentators note that forced departures in royal contexts often signal procedural recalibration rather than immediate danger. That reframing reduces anxiety while acknowledging seriousness. International observers are likewise attentive but restrained. Diplomatic calendars remain unchanged. Communications remain routine. This steadiness suggests confidence that the matter is contained within institutional review rather than escalating toward broader implication. What remains unsettled is timing. The longer the review continues, the more the absence itself becomes part of the story. Yet timing cuts both ways. Rushing risks error. Waiting risks speculation. The palace appears willing to tolerate the latter to avoid the former. Historical patterns offer some guidance. When royal households encounter findings that challenge internal assumptions, responses tend to be incremental. Return is staged. Access is restored selectively. Language remains neutral. Over time, continuity resumes without fanfare. Only retrospect reveals that a recalibration occurred. Whether this situation follows that pattern will depend on the scope of what was found. If contained, the return to Windsor may be quiet and deliberate. If broader, adjustments could extend longer with changes implemented before any return is considered. In either case, the absence will be resolved through process, not proclamation. Public patience is an underappreciated factor here. Thus far, reaction has been attentive rather than alarmed. That restraint grants the palace room to complete its work. It also reflects trust built over time, trust that silence, in this context, is purposeful. The question many are asking, what exactly was discovered, may never be answered directly. And that is not unusual. Institutions often address findings through correction rather than disclosure. Outcomes are visible. Causes remain internal. For observers, that can be unsatisfying. For governance, it is often effective. William and Catherine's forced departure, unsettling as it sounds, fits within this logic. It created the conditions for assessment without interference. It reduced pressure to reassure prematurely. It signaled seriousness internally without amplifying concern externally. As this phase continues, attention should remain on signals rather than statements. Do access restrictions ease? Do routines normalize? Do senior figures return without explanation? These markers will indicate resolution more clearly than any single line of text. Until then, the palace will likely maintain its measured posture. Controlled movement. Limited communication. Focused review. This is not opacity for its own sake. It is discipline applied to uncertainty. The discovery has already achieved one outcome. It interrupted assumption. Once interrupted, assumption rarely returns unchanged. That alone suggests lasting impact, even if the public never learns its precise nature. For now, Windsor remains a question rather than a place. And questions handled carefully can strengthen institutions rather than weaken them. As the review neared its final stages, the tone inside palace operations shifted from scrutiny to synthesis. This is the phase where findings are no longer isolated facts but patterns, where questions about what was discovered give way to decisions about what must change. And it is in this phase that the meaning of William and Catherine's departure from Windsor becomes fully clear. By this point, the objective was no longer to locate the issue, but to ensure it could not recur. That distinction matters. Institutions rarely fail because of a single anomaly. They falter when safeguards assume permanence. The palace's response suggests an understanding that continuity depends on renewal. Even in spaces steeped in tradition, sources familiar with the process indicate that recommendations were consolidated quietly. Not dramatic overhauls, but targeted reinforcements. Clarified oversight, strengthened verification, updated access controls. These measures are designed to be invisible once implemented, precisely because their success lies in preventing future disruption rather than explaining past concern. William and Catherine's continued distance during this phase served a final purpose, allowing conclusions to stand on evidence alone. Their absence ensured that decisions were not interpreted as accommodations. When senior figures return after review, the return itself becomes the signal that conditions have been met, not merely managed. The palace's silence, maintained throughout, now reads less like withholding and more like closure in progress. Once a system has absorbed a shock and adjusted accordingly, explanation often becomes redundant. Stability resumes not because questions were answered publicly, but because risk was addressed privately. This approach reflects a long-standing institutional philosophy. The monarchy communicates outcomes through continuity. When life resumes without interruption, it implies that underlying issues have been resolved to satisfaction. The absence of further movement rather than a statement becomes the reassurance. Attention, therefore, turns to markers of return. Not announcements, but rhythms. When staff access normalizes, when routines reestablish themselves, when presence resumes without comment. These markers are already being watched closely, not for spectacle, but for confirmation that recalibration is complete. It is worth noting that forced departures do not always conclude with immediate returns. Sometimes distance becomes permanent in subtle ways. Routines shift, preferences change, priorities reorder. Even when Windsor re-enters the family's orbit, the experience may have reshaped how it is used when it is chosen, and what assumptions accompany it. For William, this episode reinforces a leadership instinct that has been visible before. Protect process first. Explain later if necessary. His role throughout has been measured, informed, present, but not directive. That restraint preserves credibility, both internally and publicly. Catherine's influence has been quieter but no less significant. Stability at home, discipline in conversation, and avoidance of speculation create an emotional buffer that allows institutions to work without pressure. In moments like these, that buffer is invaluable. Public reaction, which initially leaned toward unease, has matured into patience. The absence of leaks, sensational framing, or conflicting accounts has prevented escalation. That restraint suggests a shared understanding that some matters are resolved through governance rather than narrative. Media attention has likewise shifted. The story is no longer framed as a mystery demanding revelation, but as a process approaching resolution. That shift is subtle, but it marks the transition from disruption to integration. The broader implication is not about danger avoided, but about trust recalibrated. Royal spaces function on trust layered over time. When that trust is tested, the response determines whether it fractures or strengthens. Here, the response has been methodical, disciplined, and proportionate. This episode will likely leave behind changes that the public never notices. Revised checks, refined protocols, clearer accountability. These are the quiet dividends of interruption. They do not announce themselves, but they endure. As Windsor moves back toward normal function. The memory of this pause will linger internally as a reference point, a reminder that assumptions must be earned repeatedly. For the public, the pause may fade quickly, replaced by routine coverage and familiar rhythms. That too is a sign of success. The palace has not asked for trust through explanation. It has relied on trust built through consistency. By resisting the urge to over-communicate, it preserved the integrity of the process and avoided binding itself to a narrative before outcomes were secure. When William and Catherine eventually return, whether quietly or without, notice it all. That return will close the loop. Not with disclosure, but with presence. Not with detail, but with continuity restored. Until then, the story finds its natural end here. Not in revelation, but in resolution achieved through discipline. The disturbing discovery prompted action. Action prompted review. Review prompted adjustment. And adjustment, once complete, allows life to proceed. In institutions measured by centuries. This is how moments of uncertainty are absorbed, not erased. Integrated. Windsor will resume its place, not because nothing happened, but because something was handled. And handled in a way that prioritized process over performance, stability over speed, and trust over explanation. That is the quiet conclusion to this episode. And in royal life, quiet conclusions are often the strongest ones.